tonight we are going to be working on triggers, and Ohad is here helping keep me honest and adding his knowledge and skills to the mix tonight. And in addition, since we're starting to get a little deeper into coding, if you do run into any bugs that you just can't figure out while you're coding this up, we are going to use Collab Edit as a means to share code, and I'll give a quick example of how we do that here. collabedit.com. And all you need to do, if you need to share code, choose Create a New Document, type in your name. You can switch the programming language to Java, although you don't have to, but it does make for some nice code clarification. And then all you do is copy your code into there. And then when you want to get some help on it, copy the URL and just chat that to us. And we'll be able to jump in and take a look and see if we can figure out what's missing or where the typos are. All right, so with that said, let's write some triggers tonight. So triggers, as you may already know, are Salesforce's way of allowing us to add automation onto our Salesforce orgs, a lot like workflow. They sit there watching for changes to records, and when those changes meet the criteria, they will fire. We'll take a little closer look at that and what's exactly going on, but let's write a trigger. So I'm going to switch back to my dev console here. And I know that a lot of you might be working on only one screen, so I'm going to go ahead and slide mine over, or maybe I'll slide it up so that it's only half screen here. Oh, that's a little too little. So that you'll have room to do the same thing in your dev console and hopefully be able to see both. And what I'd like you to do is copy this trigger by typing it out. So rather than cutting and pasting, you're now going to start really working with typing it and, of course, all of the hazards that ensues. Fortunately, this is a very short one, especially because once you choose File, New, and Apex Trigger, it's going to prompt you for a name and the object. So that object will be contact. And I'm calling this one contact before trigger. You really could call it anything, but a convention for naming triggers is to identify what they do. And in this case, this one is handling before events. Another convention can be naming them after an application or a function. This one is setting the title to admin. So another possible name could be admin title trigger. But it really depends on just what your org needs to organize all of those names. So go ahead and give it a name and set it to contact. And you're going to get line 1 filled out for you when you do that. And then all you're going to have to do is type in lines 2, 3, and 4. So I will give you a couple minutes to do that. And when you think you're finished and you're able to save it without any problems, you can switch over to your UI and create a new contact there and see if the title does in fact get set to admin after you save that record. And to let us know when you are finished with that, go ahead and just type done in the chat so we can get a sense of how people are doing with it.
Let's see who we get done from first.
Jen Lee, first done.
Woohoo! Oh, she even wrote, woohoo!
Alternately, you can also click that link that I put at the top of the chat, and that'll go off to the GitHub gist that has this, along with the unit test we'll be adding for this later.
Hey, Luke. This is Brooks.
Yeah. Hi, Brooks.
Hey, sorry to interrupt you. I'm not seeing the link that you posted in the chat.
Oh, really? All right. Let me repost that then here.
Thank you.
Oh, looks like merely touching it in the chat window popped it back open. So
I got it. I posted it.
Doubly
both
posted.
posted it.
Got it. Thank you.
Sajayan is done.
All right. All right. So it looks like we are, a majority of us have done this now. And was everyone able to create a contact in the UI and verify that title got set to admin?
Yep, worked great.
Very good. Anyone not get that result? All right. Well, we will assume that that did work. So now let's talk about what we have here. What happens? So this trigger is on contact, and triggers can only be on one object. So you'll end up having many different triggers, some for leads or accounts or opportunities. And essentially, it just sits there waiting for something to happen on the contacts records. And that something can be either the creation of a new record, like we just did, and that's called an insert, or it can be an edit to existing records, that would be an update. And then there's also actions for delete and undelete. Insert and update are by far the most common ones, common type of events that you use on triggers. And then in addition to that insert and update, there's also the ability to do to watch for events before or after the insert or the update. So in this case, we're doing it before insert. But it could also be after insert, and we'll do one of those shortly. But what does that mean, before insert, before update, after update? I think a good way of thinking of that is sort of thinking about when the record is being edited in the interface. So I'll switch over to my Salesforce UI here, and let me open up a contact. Yeah, let's get this list here. So when I click Edit, I, of course, go to the screen with all of the fields and the values. And I can make changes in here right now. I can delete the mobile number, and I can add a mailing city. And right now, this is sort of in the before update stage. Nothing has been saved or committed to the database. As soon as I click Save, then it's going to be committed to the database, and we slip into the after update. Now, of course, doing this in the UI, it all just happens and the screen refreshes. But under the hood, after you click Save, Salesforce immediately starts to check for triggers on contact, and if it finds any that are set for after update, it's going to say, well, this record was just updated. Now let's see if any of the conditions apply and any changes need to be made. Similarly, on insert, when we start out and we click New, right now the record hasn't been saved to the database. So we could start filling out information. And I better associate this with an account. And now I can go ahead and make any other edits I want on this, but it hasn't been saved to the database yet. Now, as soon as I click Save, it commits to the database, and it immediately finds that trigger that we had written, the before insert trigger. And there it sees that the instruction is to set the title field to admin. And indeed, it has done just that. So to sort of correct myself and be a little more accurate, when I did click Save on that, it started the process of saving it. It found that before insert, and it executed that. And then it actually saved it, and it looked for any after insert triggers, but didn't find any, so it just proceeded on and then committed the record and displayed the changes to me. Let's go back to our developer console here. And I'll expand this so we have a little more visibility, or a little less noise, I guess. So a trigger, this one on before insert, can also operate on multiple events. And I can add those additional events in here, just separating them with commas. There are a total, I think, of there's either 7 or 9 events, and it's out in the documentation. We'll probably take a look at that a little bit later. But now, if I have this on both before insert and before update, that means that this will also apply to records that I choose to update. So if there's an existing record, let's go back and see what
a good example, Luke, was if you remove the before update.
All right.
If you go back to the same contact you were just on and remove the before update.
Sure. Okay. And save it.
So basically, this trigger only fires when before we're inserting, meaning only new records. So if you go back to that contact and you change it from admin to anything else,
right?
And save it, it will not do anything.
So its title is CFO. We're going to leave that as is, but I'll make some other edit on here. Let me remove.
You can even change the title to whatever you want.
Right.
It will not override it.
And that's because I'm just doing updates to an existing record.
But now if you add that, yeah.
Go back and add before update. Now if I edit this record, say I'll put the birth date back. Now when I do this, we can see the title was set to admin. So that's because we added before update.
And an important note to say here is that inline edit is just the same as any other edit. So Salesforce, as far as the database is concerned, doesn't matter if you're doing an inline update or you click on the edit button, you go into edit mode. Once you click save, it is a record update.
Right. And that same applies to workflow field updates, really anything that changes that record. So if there was some workflow field update that happened to trigger for this record to some unrelated change, this would all kick in as well. All right, so let's keep moving along in our trigger here. So after we've defined the events in a pair of parentheses, we get to the part where we start to put our actions in place. And those go in these outer curly brackets, the one that starts here and ends at the very end of the file. Anything in between there is going to be evaluated and is the place you put all of your actions. Now, triggers can operate on multiple records. So if you are inserting a list of new contacts with a CSV in the data loader, it's going to work on all of those records that you insert. So we are always aiming to bulkify our triggers. And bulkifying is what we call the process of avoiding the governor limits. So I'm going to let Ohad explain that in just a moment, but I want to give an example first in the UI of just what that can look like. So I'm going to go back over here and go back to my list of contacts. And I'm going to do multiple edits here. So I'll select 3 records. And then let's see, how about I wipe out the phone numbers? Give them all the same, give them all the same phone number, use that all 3 selected records. So I'm updating 3 records, and when I refresh now, all 3 of them were changed to admin. And the way the trigger treated that is it saw 3 records coming in, and so it applied that to all 3 of those records simultaneously. So, Ohad, are you ready to give us a little more detail on bulkification?
I am excited to do so.
Okay.
So bulkification is one of those magic words that when you talk to any experienced developer, it's kind of like one of those Bible words that you must obey. So if you are a new developer and you're trying to write a trigger and you forgot to bulkify it and you ask some senior developer to look at your code, he will laugh at you, smack you in the head, and tell you, go bulkify it. That's the first thing anybody will ever notice. And so Salesforce does this really cool thing. When you try to process multiple records, it doesn't try to run all of them as a separate context. Right, so think about it. If you're updating 5,000 records now, and Salesforce will need to run the trigger once for every record, you're really creating an inefficient program. It will take a lot more time to update the database than it would if we can run a program that can handle all 5,000 records kind of simultaneously. So it's really about efficiency. And as always, Salesforce as a multi-tenant environment really has to be concerned about what's the most efficient thing to do. You know, you and I may be updating 5,000 records, but when you have 1,000 companies doing the same thing on an environment on one server, efficiency is very, very critical. So with that, an important thing to understand is that Salesforce will always pass up to 200 records in a single trigger. What that means is that even if you're uploading a CSV file with 5,000 accounts or contacts, Salesforce actually breaks it down to 200 records at a time. So if it's 5,000, it's going to actually run the trigger 25 separate times. And it expects that your trigger will always know how to handle all of the records that it's passing it. So a lot of time when you write a trigger, in your mind, you're only thinking about, okay, this trigger is going to run when a user is trying to update the account. So you don't really think about, okay, I need to have this trigger handle more than 1 record at a time. But because things can be updated from workflows, data loader, API calls, list view edits like Luke just did, and a couple other ways, you really always, 100% of the time, whenever you write a trigger, you want to make sure it's bulkified. And so how do we really bulkify a trigger? the first thing to understand is that when we use a trigger, look, thank you. Salesforce gives us a couple of predefined lists and maps that we can work with. So you can see that what we are doing here, in line 2, we're actually starting a loop, right? We're using a for loop. We're identifying a transient variable called C that is going to be the variable we process inside the loop. And then it says, run this loop for contact C in trigger.new. So trigger.new is this wonderful, wonderful thing, which is really a list of records. In this case, because we're running this trigger on contact, it's going to be a list of contacts. And as we cycle through this loop, we basically, I'm sorry, my computer is acting up. Sorry. As we cycle through this loop, we're going to handle each contact independently. Right, so we've done this before. We've done loops where we go through a list of set of records, and we've handled each one inside the loop. One of the things that you might notice is that we don't have an update statement here. And we'll talk about that actually in a moment. So we talked about trigger.new. Trigger.new is a list of the records that came in. Salesforce also provides us something called trigger.old. Trigger.old is a list that will be exactly identical to trigger.new in the records that get passed in it. So if you used, if we updated 3 contacts, the same 3 contacts will be in the .new and in the .old. The difference is that the .old has the old values before the update has been clicked or saved or whatever it is. So you actually have the ability to compare what are the new values that that the user entered versus what they were before the save was done. And that is, of course, you can imagine a million things where you want to check what was there before the user submitted a change. If you ever used formulas a little bit more advanced, you know that Salesforce have the formula function called prior value. And that's basically what it does. It looks at the .old value of the record that you're working with. In addition to the trigger.new and trigger.old, Salesforce also gives us maps that we can use. I won't really go into much detail, but essentially the map is exactly identical to the trigger.new list. The only difference, of course, is that it's a map, and so we can use it to use get and get a specific record from within the trigger. So as we're processing, if there's some cross-checking we need to do and make sure that maybe only one of the records includes some value, we can use that map to do that as well. I think that's it. Is there anything else I need to add about bulkification right now, Luke?
I guess I would say that the reason we bulkify is that if we don't, we will be punished when we hit the dreaded governor limits.
Mm.
So
absolutely. Yeah, sorry.
Here in the developer guide, there's a nice page of all of the possible governor limits. Governor limits are the things that Salesforce says you cannot do more than these in a transaction. Otherwise, they consider it to be too processor intensive, and you'll end up taking more resources than they are willing to share to each of us. And as you can see, it's a pretty lengthy list. Fortunately, most of these you're just never even going to get close to. So there's really only a couple in here that we need to worry about. And when we move on to our second trigger, we'll get a chance to break the governor limits and see how we get punished.
Right. So, just to put some context or terminology here, some of the lowest limits that you have, when you see the first one, the SQL query is 100, DML statements you can only do 150. What does that mean? So SQL queries, you know what it is. But the reason that those are always the lowest governor limits is because going into the database and asking the database to get data is always the slowest action for the server. Because what it needs to do is it actually needs to go and ask, hey, get me this information from the hard drive of the server, and hard drives are very slow. Once you have something, once you queried something, you got it from the hard drive and put it into memory, memory is much faster. So Salesforce can allow you to do a lot more things with things in memory. And so again, you know what SQL query is, and that's one of the reasons why SQL query limit is so low, 100, compared to some of the tens of thousands that you see in other areas. The other one is called DML. And basically, every time you try to commit something to the database, that's called a DML transaction. So the DML stands for data manipulation language, if you care. So if you do an update, an insert, a delete, that's considered a DML. And so again, just for the same reason, it goes to the hard drive. It's the slowest activity. Salesforce really needs to make sure you don't do too many of those.
All right. So we'll be jumping onto our after trigger in just a minute as soon as we finish discussing the before trigger here, and then we'll start to try and break those governor limits. All right, so we saw that we were just really working with a for loop here, really working just with a list of contacts. That's all that trigger.new and trigger.old are. And it is a list of all the contacts that were either simultaneously inserted or updated. So when I updated those 3 records in the list view, trigger.new had all 3 of those contacts in there. And our for loop went through each one at a time, called it C with the variable name C while it was in the loop, and then it moves on to line 3, and that's where it sets the title of each one to admin. So this is about the simplest trigger that you can have here. But let's go ahead and move on to one that's a little bit more complex. So
look, I do want to spend a little time talking about the difference between before and after. So just tell me when you feel is the right time to get into a little bit more detail there. Not too much, I promise.
Let's let everyone write an after trigger here, and then we'll start discussing the differences between before and after. So once again, this is your chance to code in a trigger, and I'll also go ahead and copy the link for the gist that has this, or you can just read it off the screen here. And one thing to note, when you create your new trigger, you're going to have to change the event from the default of before insert, and you're going to have to replace that with after insert. And then, of course, fill in lines 2 through 8. So go ahead and give that a go. And after you've got that saved, you can insert a contact into the UI and see if the department gets set to IT, like we've intended our trigger to do.
Look, I'm going to send you a personal message with a link I would like to show on the screen when we talk about before or after.
Okay. Got it. First one done. Second one done.
Hey, Luke, and the way to test this is you want to create another new contact after we've copied the trigger?
That's right. Create another new contact, and we should see both title get set to admin as well as department get set to IT.
Cool, thank you.
All right, it looks like everyone has had success writing that one.
Woo!
And so now we have created our second trigger, the after trigger. And let me pull this nice flow chart that we have here onto the screen. And this is from the erstwhile sfdc99.com website that I so frequently send people to. And this is a nice flowchart of when to use before and after triggers. And hopefully this will all fit on the screen. Just about, there we go.
So I think it's in general, people want to understand when to use before, after triggers. There's obviously a lot to know about it, but I'll try to keep it very simple. As Luke said before, before triggers actually happen before the data is committed, before the data is sent to the database. So once the user clicks save, immediately it goes into the before trigger. Salesforce basically says, okay, before I even go into the database, let me check if there's any before triggers. Before triggers might change the values on the record like we did now with the title, or they may validate. We may want to check that something is legal. We may use it as sort of a more advanced validation rule. And so that always happens in the before trigger. After triggers are generally used when we want to update something in a different object. The reason that we have to use after for that is, think about it this way. When you do something before it's inserted into the database, it doesn't have an ID yet. So if you want to take that contact and update some other table with that contact ID, you can't do it. The contact has not been assigned with an ID yet. So as a general rule, you'll always want to use a before trigger. You can see that almost everything in this flowchart leads to before. Almost the only time that you'll ever want to use an after is if you need, for some reason, to use the ID of the record that you're inserting. Now, of course, with an update, the record ID exists before as well. But in general, you can also assume that you'll almost always use before, even for updates.
The one caveat I would like to demonstrate about the before insert trigger is that there is the hazard that if you have something go wrong when you're trying to insert the record, it may never make it into your database. So let's see an example of what can go wrong. So we know that we have that before insert trigger that was setting the title to admin. I prepped a validation rule here. And this validation rule says that if the title is not null, throw an error and do not let it proceed. So let me go ahead and activate this one. And now if I were to try and create a contact in the UI and test my validation rule here, and give it an account. When I go to save this, we get the familiar validation rule behavior, and it tells me you cannot add a title. That was my validation rule. And it did that because the code was trying to make title admin and therefore kicked in the validation rule. In the UI, this is something that can be handled, or at least we see the message. But if this was coming in through the API, that record's never going to make it there. And this can get particularly hazardous with things like web to lead. So if you had this similar situation set up with leads and you're using the web to lead, that lead is never going to make it to your database, and your marketing and sales teams are going to start complaining about not getting as many leads as they expect. So that is one thing to consider on before insert, that if you have anything that could potentially block that record or throw an error, it might never make it in.
Well, you know what's interesting is that after insert doesn't really solve the problem. Theoretically, it doesn't even, theoretically after insert should also kick the this kind of validation, but it doesn't because of the order of execution, which is probably the next thing we should touch on.
All right.
So order of execution is something that as an administrator you may or may not be familiar with. I think that more experienced administrators have been exposed to what is called order of execution. But whenever you do something in Salesforce, whenever you save a record or update a record, there's a very specific order in which Salesforce tries to do different things. What runs first, a workflow or a validation rule? That is the kind of things you usually think about as an admin. What runs first, a workflow or a process builder? But as an admin, you also have to, as a developer, you have to add, of course, all the programmatic things you can do. What runs first, a trigger or a validation rule? Well, there's a very good question, but it's actually a little bit more complicated because a before trigger runs in a different time than an after trigger. So this is somewhere where you can start seeing how these things impact, what you do, and exactly the example that Luke gave is something that could really, really, hurt a company in the long run if it's going on for a while unnoticed. So, you can see the first, if you just Google Salesforce order of execution, you'll get to exactly the page that Luke is on right now. And so you can see exactly what happens. The first thing, we won't go through the entire thing right now maybe, but the first thing that happens, the original record gets loaded. Then the new record fields values from the request gets loaded and overwrite the old values. This is when you get your .new and .old list generated. If the request came from a standard UI page, it runs a validation to check the record's compliance with layout-specific rules. So if you have a page layout that requires a field or any other definitions on the layout, right? And then the next thing, it will execute all the before triggers. So you see that the before trigger runs before the validation, and the next thing that runs is the validation. So that is why the before trigger updated the title to admin, and then the validation rule ran. But if we had done that title update in the after, it would have been after the validation, and it would have actually entered the database. Obviously, we can continue down the list. After the validation rules, it goes to duplicate rules. Then it actually saves it to the database, but it doesn't commit yet. So another thing to understand about save to the database Salesforce, and actually really any database, has two types of saving data. There's the initial one, which is really the insert or the save that will actually allocate the space in the database. In Salesforce case, will create the ID, but it actually does not mean that the data is going to be really, really saved. And the really, really saved is what we call commit. So even after the insert, there may be other things that may prevent it from actually completing the transaction. So if you have a trigger that does a bunch of things before, then a trigger that does a bunch of things after, the before completed, so the data was already inserted, no validation rules fired, everything is fine, then your after trigger does something illegal, or maybe exceeds the number of DML transactions, your entire transaction is going to fail, and even though it was inserted and an ID was assigned, it's not going to be committed. And so the transaction, as long as the transaction fails, Salesforce rolls it back and nothing gets saved. So that's what it means in step 6. It saves it, but it doesn't commit it. So it's saved in the database, but it's really not finalized yet. So after it inserts it, it will execute the after triggers. So that's why we already have the ID. It will then execute any assignment rules, any auto-response rules. Only then, after everything had happened, it will execute the workflow rules that you have. And after that, if any workflow has field updates, then it will actually perform an update again on the fields, on the record. So it actually goes kind of back to step 1. If the record was updated with a workflow field update, it fires the before update triggers again and after triggers again. But now we're actually already in the before update and before and after update. So even if this is an insert transaction and you have a workflow that made some change to the record, you're now in the after update or before update territory. And then it will actually run it one more time. Custom validation rule, duplicate rules, and escalation rules are not run again. So that is why if you do something that changes it on the after, it will never hit the validation rules again, if your after trigger updates something. Only after all this is done, it will actually execute any process builder. After that, escalation rules, entitlements, roll-up summaries at that point, and criteria-based sharing evaluation is done in the end, and only after all this is successful. So in other words, if anything up to step 18 fails, basically nothing happens. It all gets rolled back. Step 19 is when it actually gets committed to the database. And then finally, after the commitment, you have any post-commit logic such as sending email. So order of operation is actually something that, as an admin, you're probably familiar with it. You may have actually had to consider it many times when you talk about validation and workflow rules. And you know, on the workflow, you have that ability to reevaluate after the update. So that's exactly what it means. Do you want to actually go back and try to check again after the update? But as a developer, the order of execution is absolutely something that you need to be mindful of. It's important to understand how these things are related to one another, what happens first and what happens later. There's a reason why this is in the the developer certification, even though the developer certification doesn't actually include code. But a lot of times if you start writing trigger, you will find yourself maybe asking, wait, why is this not behaving the way I wanted? And the order of execution may sometimes be the answer. So I don't know if anybody has any questions about that, but I think that's it.
And all of this happens in milliseconds and really makes you appreciate the power of Salesforce's cloud, as well as justifying the governor limits that make sure that these keep happening in milliseconds and that others aren't gobbling up all of the process. All right, let's go back to our trigger here and start talking our way through this one. So line 1 is pretty similar to what we had before. We can see that it's on contact and after insert. So let's take a look at the guts of this trigger. So if we look in the middle, we can see we've got our for loop again. And as before, we're using trigger.new. That's the list of all the contacts that were inserted. And this time, calling the contact con in trigger. So that's just the variable name there. But now, because we're in an after trigger as opposed to a before trigger, we can't just simply say title equals admin, or in this case, department equals IT. Because in after triggers, we actually have to explicitly say that we want to update the records. And that's because at this point, in the after triggers, the record has already been saved to the database. Not committed yet, but saved. And therefore, if we want to make any changes to it, we have to explicitly say we are going to update this record and tell Salesforce, all right, even though it's saved, we have some changes we want to make before it's committed. And that takes a slightly more complex approach to doing this, particularly in bulkification. So the way we've handled that here to make sure that this trigger remains bulkified is that we set up our own list of contacts in addition to trigger.new. So I do that here on line 2. I created a list of contacts. I called that list cons to update, and I set it up as an empty list to start with. Then we go on to our for loop, and it starts going through each of the contacts that were inserted that show up in trigger.new. Then on line 5, we have sort of a not very intuitive syntax here. And the syntax is really just telling Apex we're about to work with a contact. So we start by saying it's a contact, and we're going to call it C. And then the syntax requires us to say, well, treat this as a new contact right now. But then we sort of contradict that because the thing that we must do in this scenario is give it the ID of the existing contact. So I do that by setting the ID field of my supposedly new contact to the ID that came in from the trigger.new. So con and trigger here is referring to the variable name that I used in my for loop. And it says get that particular contact's ID, and that's going to be the ID of our supposedly new contact. Then things get a little back to normal. We say, all right, and then change the department field to IT. And we have to close that off with a parenthesis and our ever familiar semicolon. At this point, we've just sort of made that change in memory, and we're going to add that contact C to that list that I created on line 2. And then if there are multiple multiple contacts being inserted, it's going to keep looping through until it has addressed all of the contacts in trigger.new, and then it exits the loop here on line 7. Finally, on line 8, we say now update all of the contacts that we added to the contact list called cons to update. And update is that DML command that Ohad mentioned earlier. And that is what is actually handling the forcing that change on a record that was just inserted. It's also the thing that is the governor limit hazard that we have here.
Luke, if I can make a couple notes here.
I could tell you were ready to.
So first of all, just to kind of go over again what you said and just maybe say it in a different way to clarify if it wasn't clear to someone. So once we went into the for loop, line 5, what it really does, it actually creates a brand new contact, right? So we've used this before in our previous sessions, and we say, we used it for, let's say, string s equals new string, open close parenthesis, and semicolon. We could have done exactly the same thing here with contact. We could say just contact C equals new contact, open close parenthesis, and then semicolon. And then we can always do in a follow-up step, we can say c.id equals to contrigger.id, and then c.department equals IT. But doing it in the parentheses just saves us some times and lines. And so really, we're creating a new contact. We're telling that contact, hey, your ID should be the same as the other contact that we're looking at, and your department should be IT. If you remember when we were talking about loops originally, we talked about something called the scope of variables, and we talked about it not in too much detail. But if you remember, we talked about variables that you create inside curly brackets only live inside those curly brackets. So what that means is that contact C variable that we created only lives inside that loop every time that it runs. So as we cycle through that loop, when we go to the next time we run the loop, let's say we had 3 contacts, when we go to the second instance of the loop, there's no more contact C, and we're basically creating a brand new contact C. The way that we help it live through is by adding it to the list. So that's what we do in line 6. And then one more note about this, and we talked about bulkification, and we talked how important it is to save your DMLs and so on. One of the things that I see a lot from new developers is putting the update on an individual record instead of a list. So in triggers, you always want to work with lists or sets or whatever, any kind of collection, and you never, ever, 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 ever want to see any kind of DML or SOQL query inside a loop. So I never want to see any updates, inserts, deletes, or a select statement inside a loop. The reason is, think about it, if you have a CSV that you're uploading with 5,000 contacts, we said the trigger only handles 200 at a time. So you're going into your trigger now. If you had your update, let's say we just had update C instead of line 6, we would have just had update C. It would have worked. It would have worked perfectly as long as your trigger is handling under 150 records. Once you get above that 150, you're actually trying to run that update more than 150 times. You hit the governor limit, and it fails. So what Luke is showing on the screen right now would work perfectly as long as you're updating less than 150 records, which is never, ever an assumption you should be making when you write a trigger. Oh, this will only be updated one at a time is great for a user, maybe for a developer, for an admin, never for a developer. And that's all I had to say.
All right. Well, let's break something here. Let's put on our QA hats and think about how do we test triggers to see if they are faulty. So as Ohad warned, we never want to do DML statements like update in our for loop, because it's going to do that update once for every single contact in trigger.new. And it just so happens that I have a CSV here with 151 new contacts in it. And I want to get back to that governor limit page here and show you what we're about to violate in the governor limits. So we're about to violate our total number of DML statements issued. I can do up to 150 of them, but if I try and do 151, as we'll see in a second here, we're going to get a unfriendly error. Now, the first thing I need to do, I think I need to activate my contact after trigger. And just to see that, hey, it works fine as long as we're only adding one new contact, let's go ahead and add one new contact.
Did you save it with the update inside the loop?
Yes, I certainly did. And Salesforce will let you save it. It will not call foul. Oh, looks like I still have my validation rule fouling things up. All right, where did I leave that validation rule? All right, let's deactivate that and try and save that contact again. So I was able to save one contact and insert that, and it does go ahead and add the department of IT. All right, but now I'm going to go off to Workbench because it's a nice way for me to
Look, I'm sorry to interrupt you. I think when you activated the trigger, you may have reverted to the old version. Can you just check before you try this?
That's a great point. I bet you're right. Let's see here.
Why are you doing that? Is it OHAD? OHAD?
OHAD, yeah.
OHAD. Hey, this is Brooks. I had a question for you. You were talking about the for loop for this contact after trigger, and we're creating that contact C, kind of, and then really just assigning it to the ID value of the different contacts that are coming through the trigger.new list. Could you, instead of doing that, just have the con in trigger.department equals IT, and it would still function the same? Could you do that without having to does that question make sense?
Not in an after trigger. The reason is you cannot call update trigger.new after the fact. So you cannot call update on trigger.new. So if you just changed the IT in the trigger.new value, you wouldn't have no way of calling the trigger to update it.
I think maybe I told you wrong. I just chatted you over what I was trying to talk about. And
okay.
See what you think there. Like you're still throwing it to the cons update list.
Well, you wouldn't do cons to update add.c because you don't have C. Let me just share what you just typed. Let me share that with the entire team so everybody can see that.
Here, I'll give you the collab edit I'm on following Luke's instructions if that's helpful.
I can actually also run through that example as well here.
I pasted the wrong thing. You can do this, but you would not be adding C. You would be adding con in trigger.
Oh, yeah, you're right. But you could do it
But
that way, right?
that would work, actually, correct.
Okay,
well,
thank you.
No, actually, I don't think it would. I'm sorry, I don't think it would because, interestingly, what you're doing here is you're instantiating a new contact. That's why you have that contact C equals new contact. You're just assigning it the same ID. I'm not sure. I don't think it would work the way you did it. And you can try. You can very simply save it. And
we'll give that a try because it's just as important for us to be seeing how things break here. That's one of my goals in the webinar, when we is to see how things fail, because we go to these nice slick presentations at Dreamforce and they have everything planned out and they never get errors. So you never really learn, all right, what is that error? What did I do? How do I get around it? So we'll see if we can invoke the error we get from Brooks' example right after I go ahead and break some governor limits here. So thanks to Ohad's quick eye, he noted that by activating it in the UI, I had replaced the changes. So I restored my update into the for loop. And now I'm going to go off to Workbench, and I'm going to use it to insert a file of CSVs. Or must select an object. Try that again. Contact, right. I have to tell it what I'm about to insert.
Workbench is so picky.
So it automatically recognized the field names from my CSV. I'm going to take a look at what that CSV looked like. It just has a last name and the account ID. So I'll go ahead and click Map Fields. And I will confirm insert. And it starts churning through those. And bang, I get my limit exception. Too many DML statements. 151, and that's because back here in the trigger, trigger.new had 151 new contacts, and it started looping through them, and every time it got to line 7, it attempted to update each contact one at a time. And it was doing fine until it got to that 151st contact, and at that point, it hit the governor limit, and it rolled back the entire transaction. None of those contacts got inserted. And that's why we always bulkify our triggers by adding them all to a list, because we can update that list with 150 contacts without any hazards. Let's just see if we can pull that off here. So let's go back.
Well, just to add, there is actually a limit on how many records you can update at a time, but it's much higher.
Right. Map my field, confirm insert, and bang, 151 new contacts, all set with department equals IT. All right, let's break something else. Let's see if we can figure out what Brooks's suggestion would generate as an error. So Brooks was kind of saying, well, that nice pattern that we had in the before trigger, which was really so compact, can we do something like that here? And so I'll go ahead and just comment out what we had previously. So we know that because we have defined con in trigger as an instance of a contact in trigger.new, what if we say con in trigger and then say the department field on contact and make that equal IT? And then what if we add that to our list of contacts, add, and we have to reference it as con in trigger. So now we've done that, and I think it's going to let me save. I don't think we'll hit any error there. And now I'll go over to the UI and see what happens when I try and add one in. I can honestly say I'm not sure what error this might throw. Test contact 2. Great name. All right, save. Aha. Ah, there it is. That is the error that it's saying. The key words there is record is read only. And what that means in the context of our trigger is that because we're working in the after insert, the record has already been saved, not committed, but saved to the database. And if we want to edit it again, we essentially have to open it up for editing. And that's what this particular line, number 5, is doing. It's reopening that record for editing. It's doing it because we gave it the specific ID and are treating it as a sort of a new contact in memory while we make those changes.
So that's really the difference. It's really where it is in memory, right? When you have it in trigger.new, even if you add it to another list, it's always the same. The list basically points to the same record in memory. So if you ever have two lists right? If you create a list, let's say, of contacts, and then you add the contacts from that list to another list, and you update one of the lists, you'll notice that the contacts in the other list is also updated. Because even though you have two lists, you're still referencing the same contact record in memory. By creating a brand new contact, we're actually assigning a new contact in memory, and it just happens to be that it has the same ID. So assigning the ID on a new contact to an existing contact is kind of a trick to say, hey, even though I told you it's a new one in memory, it's actually one that already exists, and here's the ID for that. So whenever you try to update it, it will update the contact that you gave the ID for. So I hope that clarifies it a little bit why that did not work.
Yeah, thank you very much.
And to address a question that, let's see, who asked it a minute ago? Sajian asked, will line 5 do a select internally and fetch the contact with the con in trigger.id? And the answer is no, it's not doing a select. It's not actually doing a query at that point because it doesn't need to. What it's doing at that point is finding the ID that's in memory. It's in trigger.new already, so it doesn't have to do a query. Now, if we wanted to get information from this contact's parent account, we would have to do a query. We would have to do a select statement to get additional fields from the account, such as the account phone number or address. But everything about these contacts, the ID and all of their fields, are available to us in trigger.new, so it can just pull them in with that dot notation reference there. Similarly, I could also pull the name by saying con and trigger.last name. It knows what that is already because it's contained in trigger.new. All right, are we ready to turn this up yet another notch? Let us go to our next trigger, which is a contact compare trigger. And now this one gets a bit lengthier, so rather than making you type all of this one out, let me go ahead and share the link to this one. And I'll let you just copy that in so that we can keep moving along. Yep, I need to broadcast to all. There we go. All right, I just chatted the link to the contact compare trigger so that you can cut and paste that into your developer console.
And by the way, just while everybody's doing that, just before Luke's link, I accidentally posted another link just before I was gonna say I was going to post it. It's just another page with some of the differences between before and after trigger. So feel free to copy that and just for your reference. It basically covers everything we just discussed, just a little bit more detail than the previous page with the simple flow chart.
And we'll make sure to include that also in the follow-up email so that you have links to all of the pages we've looked at. All right, so this contact compare trigger is essentially the equivalent of a workflow that is using isChanged. And after we take a look through this trigger, you're going to appreciate workflow oh so much more and just how much effort they save you, especially when we look at the unit tests, which we still have yet to do. So looking at this trigger, if we look on line 1, we can see that now we're operating in after update. And the reason we have switched to the after and update event is that at this point, if we want to see if something has changed, we need to be able to compare the old and the new values of a field so that we can detect a change and then do something. So we've got quite a few new concepts going on in this trigger. In addition to what we've already seen with bulkification and using our for loops and using DML, now we're going to look at adding a conditional into the trigger so that it doesn't operate on every record, but in this case, it's only going to operate on records where the phone number has changed. And the way we're able to do that is by using trigger.old and trigger.new. As Ohad said earlier, trigger.old is a list of all of the prior values prior to the update, and new are all the new field values after the update. And we're going to write our trigger in such a way that we compare two fields, or one field in the old and in the new, to see if it has changed. And the next variation that I introduce in here is using a map for my collection of contacts to be updated instead of a list. You could absolutely use a list here, just as we did in the previous ones, and you'll get the same results. But it is a good practice to use maps in your triggers, because as you start to add in more and more conditions and updates and changes into a trigger, you want to make sure that every previous change is respected and that nothing gets lost. And lists do not provide that protection the way that maps do. If we were to have multiple different updates in here on different conditions, conceivably a later update could overwrite an earlier update, and that earlier update would never happen. We'll take a look at that probably in the next session, where we look at some more advanced patterns for working with our triggers. But I wanted to introduce the concept of using a map here just to get it out of the way. All right, so there we have our map, nice and empty and waiting for us to add contacts that we want to update. And then we march on down to our for loop. Now this time, we're going to use a different condition in our for loop. It has essentially the same function, that it is going to allow us to go through each record in trigger.new. But the way it does that is using this syntax that allows us to do it incrementally. So we first start out by setting an entry condition. I define an integer that I call I, and I set its value to 0. And then I say that as long as I is smaller than the size of trigger.new, keep looping through. And with each loop, add 1 to I. So with every loop, I is going to change. It starts out as 0, works with one record, then becomes 1, works with the next record, and so on. It knows how many records are in trigger.new because we've used the size method here, and that's the number of items in trigger.new, the number of contacts that were updated. So that's how we're controlling the exact, to get the exact number of records in trigger.new. Now the reason that we do it in this way is that we actually have to reference both trigger.old and trigger.new because we need to get those field values to compare them. So because trigger.old is really just a list, we can use indexes. We can use an integer value to say, get me the data at position 0 or position 1. So when we start out, I starts out at 0. And here on line 9, we say, we're going to call a contact old, and that contact should be retrieved from the list of contacts called trigger.old, and it should be the one at index 0.
A good note to add here, just a quick one, is that trigger.old and trigger.new are always going to be ordered in the same way. So that's obviously, I think from what you're saying it's pretty clear, but I figured I'd just say it out loud.
It is.
So you know that the record in location 2 is always the same record in both lists.
Right. So we're relying on Salesforce to keep those in order.
Hey, Luke?
Yeah.
I got a question for you. Do you want me to wait till the end, or can I ask it now?
Go ahead.
So right where you're at in that for loop, contact old equals trigger.old variable I.
Yeah.
How are we able to get away with, I'm making quotes with my fingers, making a new contact called old without having to do what's written in the next and that if down there, contact C equals new contact? Wouldn't we have to, I was expecting to have to do contact old equals new contact, blah, blah, blah. How are we able to get away with that?
Because at this point, we are only reading that contact. So if you recall that error that we got that said record is read only, here on line 9, we're just saying just read that contact that is at position 0 in the list.
Okay.
But then when we get around to editing it, that's when we're going to use that new contact syntax to open it for editing.
Okay, thanks.
And then, so on line 10, we do the same thing, but from the list of contacts, trigger.new. So these are all the new field values. And I give this a variable name of NW, simply because if I try new, you'll see it turns purple, and that's Salesforce's way of saying that is a reserved word. You cannot use it. And you can see the angry red arrow has popped up telling me that something is wrong there. The actual error message is really not very helpful. It's saying expecting a semicolon, found new, and it's essentially saying it got to that word, and that word shouldn't be there. So the only clue I have is, well, all right, it's purple. That must mean it's reserved, so I always call it NW. And then we use the I again to get the same one. And because in the loop, I is going to be 0, both of those will be 0. All right, so now we've read the contact, the old values and the new values for that same contact. And now we move into our conditional statement. And here we say, all right, so we have a contact that we called old. Let's look at its phone field. And let's compare it to the same field, phone, on the contact new, NW. So it's comparing the old value of phone and the new value of phone. And if it's not equal, then we can go into our conditions actions. So here we start our conditions actions in a pair of curly brackets. And then we get into the familiar pattern we saw on the after trigger, where we open that contact for editing. We reference its ID. And it doesn't really matter here whether I use the ID from old or new. They're the same. I just chose to use new here. And finally, after all that, I get to what I actually want to do. And that is set the description to phone changed. All of that just to change one field. But we're not quite done yet, because now we need to add it to our map so that we can bulkify this and update as many contacts as come in or that are updated together. And maps, unlike lists, use the put instead of add. And I have to give it two things. I have to give it the key and the value. So since this is a map of IDs to contacts, I give it the ID of my contact, and then I give it the whole contact. That's the C that we created there on 13.
Luke, I got a question again.
Okay.
Potentially an embarrassing one, but I was going to ask, so with the map, I understand ID. When it says contact, which what you're just talking about there with the C, I was expecting
Yeah.
that would have to be another field. What does it mean when it just says contact? What is that the ID mapping to?
Let's see, which line are you referring to?
It'd be 3 map ID comma contact.
Oh, okay. So there, line 3 is creating or instantiating an empty map for us, and that is a map of the, or it's a map that is set with the key to be an ID, and then each of those is directly related to one contact. So the contact is the entire contact, all of its fields, and therefore it's sort of a kind of a collection within a collection.
Okay.
Contact is really a pretty expansive collection itself of all of last name equals and first name. So.
Okay, cool. Thanks.
Yeah. All right, so after we have gone through our loop and added all of the contacts where the phone was changed, we exit out of the loop there. And now we have to make our update, which we do here. But just in case there was actually no records where the phone was changed, I wrap that in yet another conditional where I just check to see if there are actually any records in the cons to update map that I created. So I use that size method again, and I say if it's greater than 0, then do the update. Now we can't directly update an entire map, so I have to use the values method of maps, and that just returns the second half, all of those contacts. So essentially we're just updating a list at this point, a list of contacts. So we just really threw a lot of the different building blocks that we've been talking about for the last couple of sessions here into one trigger. All of that just to check if phone has changed, and if so, to make a note of that in the description. And we did this with a lot of best practices in place. We did it with bulkification, our first and foremost best practice. We did it using a map that sort of future-proofs our trigger so that we can keep adding other loops, other conditions, other changes, and know that they will all be respected. And then we also did a best practice here of only actually attempting the update if there is something to update. And you don't have to do this last one. Nothing bad will happen if you don't. It might just take a few milliseconds longer for your records to get processed.
It's absolutely the best practice, and there's definitely scenarios where if you try to do things on lists without checking the size first, you might run into different issues. So it's a best practice at this point, but it's really becomes a kind of a requirement as you continue developing more complicated things.
And it's also sort of a good paradigm that you get into in developing in Apex or any language of just thinking about, well, if there's nothing to update, then why should I do an update?
Why should I waste a DML?
Right, right. So it's a way of thinking about the code and how to write it. And that also takes me back to something that Ohad mentioned earlier about trigger.old and trigger.new always being in the same order. That's an assumption that we make, but it's the kind of assumption that it's a good question to say, are they always in the same order? How do I know they're in the same order? What if they're not? And getting in the habit of thinking about those kind of things really can help you to write better code. And in fact, there is a way to sort of guarantee that in our triggers. The way we would do that is to, instead of using trigger.new, we're going to use trigger.newMap. So I will go ahead and make that edit here. So now I'm referencing something that's available to me in every trigger, just like trigger.old and trigger.new. Trigger.oldMap and trigger.newMap are available to us. And the only difference between trigger.new and trigger.newMap is the way in which we get something from it. With the list, we were just able to call an index number and know that we would get the record at that index. But with a map, we have to use our get. And when we use get wants us to give it the key for that map. New map and old map are a map of the ID to the contact. So just like the one we created on 3, we are looking at something where we need to get it by the ID. And we know that already because we got that on line 9 and we called it old. So I can say old.id. And now I know that when it goes to get the contact from trigger.newMap, it is going to get the exact same record that I am referencing in contact.old. Why do I know that? Because IDs are unique and I won't possibly run into another contact. I wouldn't want to use email or phone or name, something that could possibly have another record in there. ID guarantees that it is unique.
So the pattern that we see here is very, very typical by using the for loop with the identifying integer and using the size. But just as well, you don't actually, if you use this method with using the new map, you don't actually need I. You don't need to iterate by counting. You could use the same loop syntax that we've used before. We could say for contact C or contact old in trigger.old, and then just use the map to get the same new record. So again, of course, like everything else, there's a million ways to achieve the same thing. I don't think that any one of those is necessarily better than the other. Both of them would work the same way. They're both, I think, as efficient. It's really kind of a matter of thinking and habits, I think, more than anything else.
And I mostly bring this up because you might run into this type of pattern if you're looking at someone else's code, perhaps on the developer forums or Stack Exchange. You might see them using this pattern for doing comparisons rather than just comparing the lists with old and I. As you look at more code, you'll just start to see all of those different variations. So the more ways you know of expressing it, the easier it is to interpret what others have been doing with it.
Yep, and a lot of times it will also be determined, which one you want to go, depending on what else you're trying to do. So of course, these are triggers that are very simple. They don't do much. So you could go with anything you want. But if you're trying to start doing things where you want to use more lists or more maps and get some more data and then get the correct one, you might find yourself using maps more. So, again, there's just different ways to do it. In our scenario, it doesn't really matter which one you go with. In different scenarios, it may matter because you may want to do something and it may be more efficient or less efficient. Sajan is asking if in line 21 we can just do an update const to update. And Luke already mentioned that, but I'll repeat. You cannot actually update a map. An update has to be either on a set or a list. So const to update dot values returns the list of values from the map, and that you have to use that to update.
All right. So now we've created our triggers, and this is usually where I think a lot of other workbooks and trainings stop, and they shortchange us on how do we write the unit tests. Because that is the essential thing you're going to have to do if you want to be able to deploy these to your production environments.
Look, just before you go into unit test, I'm sorry to cut you again.
Go ahead.
The reason we showed it here in the after trigger is because really Luke wanted to go through and show all of these patterns that we just discussed. They're all extremely, extremely important. As you start writing code, you'll use these countless times. But having said all that, if we really just wanted to do what we did now, we could have done it before trigger, and we would have been able to cut this entire logic into probably 4 lines or 5 lines. I'm not discounting in any way using the after method here, because otherwise we would not have been able to look at all these best practices. But I felt it's important to just say we could have done this in a shorter amount of code.
And we could have done it with workflow for that matter. And if this is all you had to do, I would recommend doing it with workflow.
Agreed.
But having these simplified versions is a nice place to start from when you do need to do something more elaborate. All right, so on to our tests. So we're going to roll back to contact before trigger, that nice simple 5-line trigger we wrote at the start. And now let's take a look at how we test that. And you'll find all of these tests are in the GitHub gist. Each of the 3 triggers also lists its companion unit test. And really, you could do all of these unit tests in just one class. You don't need to do them separately. But I do like to do an individual test class for each test trigger, or for each trigger file that I create. Just helps to organize when I'm looking at dozens and dozens of triggers and classes to be able to see which ones correlate to which triggers.
And when you want to deploy an update, you know exactly which is the test class you need to update with it.
And so I call this one contact before trigger test. I put the word test at the end. That's a personal preference. I think a lot of organizations probably put test beforehand. That way they can see all of their unit tests when they sort all of the classes. But I found that I like to be able to see the trigger and the test class right next to each other when I sort them. All right, so and Jen just asked, where can I find the built test classes? Test classes, because they're just an Apex class, they're going to end up in the same place as your non-test Apex classes. So they do all get bunched together, and that can make it a bit confusing. There are some places in Salesforce where you can just see your tests, such as in the UI. There is, let's see, while I'm here I better activate my contact compare trigger so when we run its unit test it works. So under develop, if you go to Apex test execution, when you select tests, this is going to sort out all of the test classes from the non-test classes. So we can see here I've got about, maybe 15 test classes. And what's the difference between a test class and a regular class? Just one line, line 1, that says @is_test. This is something you must always add to any Apex class to turn it into a test class. And as soon as you do that, you get that nice run test button so that you'll be able to run your tests. When you're creating a test class, you just start by choosing to create an Apex class and giving it a name, test class. And it doesn't give you very much. It just gives you the name and public and class. So you always have to add is test to get it started. As soon as I do that, I get my run test button. All right, back to our contact before trigger test. Now we'll do a deeper unit on unit tests in an upcoming session. But essentially our goal in unit testing is to sort of recreate in code the actions that we expect our trigger to do, and then to verify or to assert that the result that we wanted to happen actually happened. And as we saw when we were working in the previous sessions, we used a lot of unit tests initially. And the tests don't have access to data in our database. We actually have to create our data that we're going to test. So here in this one, I have 2 unit tests, actually, 2 test methods. And this first one that I have highlighted, I've called test 1. That means I'm going to test just one record at a time. And so if I'm going to set up a test for adding a contact, well, a contact should have an account. Doesn't have to, it's not required, but just a good practice is to try and be as faithful to the data as possible. Let's see, and Jen just asked, contact before trigger test. Can you get the gist for it? Yes, let me see if I can find that here. Yep, that's the after trigger. Where's the before? There it is. All right, here comes the URL coming at you in the chat window. Okay, so here in my test class, the first thing you almost always end up doing as you write your unit tests is create your test data. So here on line 5, I create a new account that I call test account. And on line 6, I insert that. So now I've got my account in my test data. And then on line 9, I create a contact, and I assign it to that account. And I'm able to reference that account by saying A, the variable name I gave to it, and then dot notation for its ID. And then I insert my contact. So at this point, we've basically invoked that trigger. The contact before trigger was on before insert. So as soon as we say insert, that has kicked off that trigger, or at least it will when I hit the run test button. And at that point, you really have created a unit test that is running your trigger. And you could essentially stop there and say, well, I've tested it, and I'm getting code coverage, so I'm good to go. But what you haven't done is actually tested to see if the change that you expected happened. And this is the part that is easy to skip over and is a shortcut that Slacker developers take all too often. So now in the second part here, we're actually going to check and see, did the change get made? So the change was setting the title field to admin. Now, we actually have to use a query to go out and get the title from that contact we just inserted. It's not available to us until we retrieve it from the database. So here on line 13, I'm reusing my contact variable C, so I don't have to say that I'm instantiating a new contact. I can just say now C is going to be the result of this query. and I say select title, because I know that's the field I want to check, from contact. And then I use a filter that says where ID equals the ID of the contact I inserted. Now notice here this small colon. This is essential for me, for us to use in Apex when we are not giving it a hard-coded ID. Because we're using something that's dynamic here that's going to change every time I run the test, I have to use a variable, and I have to say C and the ID of that contact C.
Not just for ID. For any time in a SQL query you want to reference a variable, be it a date or created by or name or anything, and if you use a variable as your comparison, you always have to use a colon.
And now that we've run that query, we've gotten back our title value, and I can go on to the all-important system assert. Here I want to do a comparison, so I'm using assert equals. And in assert equals, I have to give it two things. The expected value, so I hard-coded in that I am expecting it to be the text admin. And then I am, again, referencing my contact C and using dot notation to say the title field on C. So it's going to then compare and see, does that record's title field contain admin? And if it does, the assert equals passes true, and our unit test succeeds. I'll go ahead and turn on the test panel and click Run Test, and it churns away, and we get our friendly green check mark saying, yes, it passed. So this was an example of testing just one record. But because we always bulkify, it's important to actually test in bulk. And it's not really very much harder. Testing one record, it took us 6 lines of code. If we look at the second test method I wrote here, to test the bulk, to test creating many records, I only had to do 9 lines. So it's not a whole lot more effort, but it is a whole lot better to do this, because I can actually test hundreds of records and verify that my code is in fact bulkified. And most of it is pretty similar to what we did for testing one. I start out, and I'm just going to use one account. I don't have to test this with hundreds of accounts. I can add all of the contacts to one account. But then to get into adding multiple contacts, I use that pattern where I set up an empty list of contacts, and I call it test contacts. And then here in a for loop is where I can add as many contacts as I want. And I'm doing that by specifically saying how many I want to add. So it's going to use that pattern of setting a starting value of 0, and it'll keep going until I is greater than 2, and it adds increments I each time through. And then I start adding my contacts. So here we really are creating a new contact. So we have that pattern, but then I don't actually have a contact ID because I'm creating them from scratch. And last name is a required field, so I do have to populate that in my contact. And just because I want each name to be unique, I'm actually going to take advantage of the fact that I is going to change every time through the loop. So it's going to start out as name 0, then name 1, and then name 2. Well, nope, name 2 doesn't work because that's when it would exit the loop. But then I also assign it to my account. So I use that same account over and over again. And then finally, I add it into my list of contacts that I prepared and keep going on through the loop. And after it's gone through the loop the expected number of times, finally I'll do my insert of all of those records. And it's going to insert them in one transaction, so that's how I know I'm testing my bulkification. Now I only did 2 here, but I could just as easily do 2,000 and really test if this is bulkified.
Now it's a pretty good practice to test, more than 100 or 150 records to make sure that you bulkified correctly.
And I will generally do that while I'm developing in my sandbox. But when I release this to production, I usually bump it back down to just 2 because I don't want my unit tests to run forever when I'm doing run all tests. So it's a way of testing it in development, but then making sure that my actual production org runs pretty quickly.
Look, Sajayan is asking a question.
Okay.
On line 9, we define new contact, and in 10 we insert it. Will this step add the variable C got the ideas generated during insert? So yes, in line 10, once we insert the contact, it will get assigned with an ID. It will also, at that point, since we're inserting, it will actually run the after insert trigger at that point. Is that the question you were asking? Or was there more to it? Okay, great.
And ID is in fact the only field value that we don't have to query for. It's the one that is automatically available to us. So that's why I was able to use the account ID here or the contact ID here, but title I did have to query for. And going back to our bulkification, or our bulkified unit test. So now we've inserted a bulk of contacts, but we also need to test all of them. So I'm going back to my for loop, and now I'm going to use yet another one of our loop techniques. And this is the one that does a loop through the results of a query. So just as I did in the previous test method, I'm selecting title from contact. And in this case, I'm just not even going to put a filter on because I wanted to get all of the contacts. I know that I'm safely in my test space, so the only contacts it's going to see are the ones that were created for this test method and this test method only. It's not going to pull in the one that I created in the previous test method. It's not going to pull in any that are actually in my database. So I'm taking advantage of the fact that I know how the test behavior is in Salesforce to keep the query simple and sweet here. So that query is going to return all of the contacts that were inserted, and then the for loop is going to go through them one at a time, calling each one C. And then once again, I do my system assert equals, and it's going to go through each of the contacts that were inserted and make sure that the title field was set to admin. And that's how you test in bulk. And in fact, as we'll see in the next unit test on our after trigger, here, I don't even bother with testing just one. If I'm testing many, that's just as good as testing one. So it's a really good practice to get into of writing all of your unit tests to handle bulk records from the start. It's a little easier to write them to just test one record, but then you have to go back and make the changes. You might as well just create it in bulk from the start. And so really, this after test is for the after insert trigger is basically the same as the one we wrote for before trigger. The only difference is that here, we're checking to make sure that department was set to IT. But other than that, everything else in this behaves just the same. So the reason we are doing these unit tests is, well, obviously to make sure our code works, but also because Salesforce isn't going to let us deploy them if we don't have enough code coverage. What does code coverage mean? That means, did we actually do every line in our trigger? If I go over to my trigger, you'll see there's this code coverage drop down. And if I click on this, it's going to check and see if there has been a test run and tell me how much of the code is covered by that. So I can see here that for my after trigger test, because all of this is highlighted in blue, that means all of those lines have been tested. That means that it saw that there were contacts that were inserted, that a department value of IT was checked, and that an update was done. But conceivably, there could also be lines that don't get tested. So if I were to, let's see, what's another good thing? What can I add?
Add an if statement. Add an if statement that will be false and put something inside that if.
Okay, good suggestion. So let's see what it looks like without coverage. So I'll say if con in trigger, and how about .phone not equal null. Then I have to copy that one down to the bottom here. And let's just clean that up a little bit. So now, because I've made a change, it automatically reverts to no code coverage. Now I'll have to run my trigger test for it to reevaluate the code coverage. And I can see that test failed because I added a condition. And the condition that I did not establish in my unit test. And we can see now it's saying this part of your code did not get tested. And if I wanted it to get full coverage, I would actually have to set up where the phone does not equal null. So I could go back to my trigger test and say, all right, now I know that in addition to a last name, I also need to populate the phone field. So I'll go ahead and do that. Run my test. And I can see the friendly green check mark saying that my test is passing again. And now when I go back here, I can see that I did cover that scenario. You are expected to have 75% code coverage to upload anything to production. But what it doesn't actually force you to do is to do the assert. So even if I were to cut out this assert, I can still run my test. The test is still going to pass. And I'm still going to see 100% coverage. So really the reason I'm doing the assert is, as the developer, I want to know that what I intend the code to do actually gets done. This is my way of protecting that code, of testing it, QAing it, and protecting it against future changes. So if somebody added a workflow that changed the department field to something else, my unit test would fail, and I would know, uh-oh, something broke, and I'd be able to go in and debug that. If I didn't have that assert equals in there, I'd never know that my code had broken.
In other words, always assert.
Always assert, and assert lots of things. We will definitely, unit tests are one of my favorite things to write, and I will be happy to explain to you all of the different things that you need to test.
Luke is probably, by the way, the only person that can ever say that sentence and mean it.
I don't know. I like writing them. I find them very, very satisfying.
I got to show you some of my test classes, Luke.
Or don't. I don't know if I want to see some slacker hacking development.
Oh no, it's not Slack. It's just some of them are extremely complex.
Oh, that's good. That's good. They should be. Unit tests will almost always be longer than your triggers. And we can see an example of that here in our final unit test. This is on our compare trigger. And this one gets a bit more complex because if you recall, that compare trigger was on update. So that means we have to set up a test scenario where not only are we inserting records, but we are updating them in a way that will qualify for our test. So here we have our familiar pattern of inserting our contacts. And then after we've done that, we go into the setup for updating those contacts. So here I create a second list, empty list for contacts. And then I loop through the list of contacts that I inserted. And I set a phone number for each of them, add them to my list, and do an update on them. So this is the point here that actually kicks off the trigger for the after update, for that contact compare trigger. Now these other parts, these are actually going to set off the before and after insert triggers, but I'm not really using this unit test to check those. But it will actually cause those to be invoked. And really, I could probably just build one massive unit test that checks all of those things. It checks that after insert. Here I could have it check that title equals admin. I could have it check that department equals IT. Of course, I'm doing pseudocode here in the interest of time. And then move on to the update and check that if the phone number is changed, that the description field gets updated to be phone changed. The reason that I don't do that and combine them all in one is that it's easier to debug my unit test when they test smaller units rather than having everything stacked up in one. So this way, if one of these unit tests fails, I know exactly which trigger to check. That said, you do often end up having multiple asserts within any test method to check for a variety of things, and it sort of just becomes a developer's choice about how exactly they want to define.
Luke?
Yeah.
Did we lose you?
I'm here. Uh-oh.
I can still hear you, Luke.
Oh, good.
Can anybody hear me?
I can hear you.
We can hear Ohad. I'm typing a chat to him. Well, we might just go on with Ohad being in the dark here at the end. So that is our introduction to triggers. And we will certainly have some more sessions on triggers, some of the things we touched on a bit here, and more on unit tests. But I did try to write these in such a way that you can reverse engineer them and use them in your own orgs as you start to develop your own triggers. And if you want to check out more about this, certainly go to Trailhead. Take a look at SFDC 99, and I'll mention some other resources in the after email. And we will be doing our next session a week from tonight. Want to get one more in before Dreamforce, and then we'll pick up again after Dreamforce the second week of October. So certainly if you have any other questions, you can ask them now or go ahead and email me, and Ohad and I will get an answer out to you. So thank you everyone for joining us tonight, and I hope to hear from you all next Thursday.